Okay, so yeah, 6 planets are retrograde right now, Erica. It is a bananas time. The universe is like LOL at us. Okay, since I've got screen sharing on, I just want to flag that it is a lot harder for me to monitor the chat while keeping up with like the content for the workshop. So if there is like a question that is like immediately urgent that like needs to be asked, or something that you need to flag for me, I would ask that you unmute yourself, if even just to flag my attention to the chat, um, and I will take a look there. But otherwise, yeah, I've only got so many eyeballs on me. So if there are questions as well that aren't like immediately urgent, please like make note of them, or you can pop them into the Q&A function for when we get to that point. All right. So hi, everyone. I'm Margot. I use they, them pronouns. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. Talking about conflict is one of my favorite things ever, and talking about communication is also up there. So this is like a 2-for-1 special for me. I want to begin first with this virtual land acknowledgement that was written by Adrian Wong. And Wong writes, since our activities are shared digitally to the internet, let's also take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization embedded within the technology, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to much of the art that we make leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. I invite you to join us in acknowledging all this, as well as our shared responsibility to make good of this time, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship. I wanted to start with this like virtual land acknowledgement as someone who is on Treaty 6 territory in what is colonially known as Edmonton, Alberta, because we are gathering virtually in this moment, and because when we're talking about technology and these structures that we use every day, we're really talking about communication. The internet allows us to connect with and communicate with people all over the world, as well as people that we are close to and in community with. In Canada, and I'm sure that this is the case outside of Canada as well, Indigenous communities are vastly underserved when it comes to access to technology. The majority of on-reserve homes, more than like 2/3 of them, do not have high-speed internet. And across like the northern parts of Canada, this is like particularly pronounced, with fewer than half of those in Nunavut having download speeds that allow them to actually be in communication. Yeah, I think that they're at like 5 megabytes per second when the industry standard is like 50. Just an hour's drive north from Edmonton, some neighborhoods in Indigenous community remain entirely cut off from the rest of the world as recently as 2016. And that still continues into today, apart from a few who can afford landlines. And, there's a project that was started on Indigenous reserves of co-sharing landlines and like access to internet as a way to ensure that everyone's like communication needs could be met. So I offer this land acknowledgement in the context of this workshop for us to think about like who has access to the means to communicate and who doesn't. I also want us to consider how colonialism has impacted how we communicate with one another. And that's not just within the context of, having access to internet or landlines, but really very much like the ways that we talk to one another. And as we move into, some of the skills that we're going to be building here today, what's really apparent to me is that we have inherited a way of communication that really leverages a power over another person, um, that has taught us that we need to be defensive, that we need to deflect. And those modes of communicating, while they might be great protective survival resources, are not actually going to help us have the kind of communication that we want to. And so just like really remembering that we're not just humans who are shaped by, our individual experiences, but we are humans that are shaped by the world that we live in. And that world, at least in North America, is intimately tied up in the project of settler colonialism. Okay, so I'll give a little outline of what we're going to do today. So I'm going to do just a super quick recap from the first workshop, just so we have a little refresher on some of the terms that are going to get used later on. And then we're going to talk about setting the stage to have hard conversations. We're going to move into the skills of active listening and how to employ those. And then we're going to finally talk about nonviolent communication, what that is, what that looks like. And then there'll be time for Q&A at the end, hopefully 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how things go. So a couple of reminders. In the first workshop, I defined a conflict as, something that happens when someone thinks that something important to them is being threatened. Whether or not that threat is real or perceived doesn't matter. And this is what differentiates a conflict from a disagreement. With a disagreement, there's really nothing at stake. Whether you like RuPaul's Drag Race or you don't, unless I'm a producer on that show or I'm like RuPaul, your opinion on that, we can disagree on that and that's not really going to matter. But conflict occurs when we have that disagreement and we believe that something we care about has been threatened. We then went through 5 different conflict styles: compete, accommodate, avoid, compromise, and collaborate. And then we linked those different conflict styles to our trauma responses. And the trauma responses, in the language that I use in my own therapy work, is we've got our fight part that's the inner critic, the fight part that is the outer critic. We've got our young attachment wounded part, which we call attach cry. And then we've got freeze, flight, and submit. Different practitioners use different language and have different, different responses that they would have in this list in exchange for others. At the end of the day, whatever language works for you is great. It's all just like a tool. I gave a couple different definitions of trauma, but the one that I want to re-emphasize today comes from Stacey K. Haynes's book, The Politics of Trauma. And Haynes writes that trauma is the experience, series of experiences, and or impacts from social conditions that break or betray our inherent need for safety, belonging, and dignity. And what I appreciate about this definition is that it's so much more capacious than the, DSM kind of singular trauma list of, like a singular event that happened. Um, but when we think about these three, I mean, and we have more inherent needs, we have like our basic human needs, that also need to be met. But these are also part of that. And so often when I'm activated and I'm not sure why my nervous system is dysregulated, I come back to these three pieces of safety, belonging, and dignity. And I ask myself, which of these is feeling threatened right now? And we'll loop this back in when we get towards the end and we talk about a little case study. So Haynes continues, they are the experiences that result in us having to vie between these inherent needs, often setting one against the other. For example, it might leave us with the impact of, I can be safe but not connected, or I have to give up my dignity to be safe or connected. This is untenable because all of these needs are constitutive or inherent in us. So, those of us with attachment trauma, we want connection so badly, but we learned that connection wasn't safe. And we learned that in order to receive connection, we might actually have to sacrifice our dignity or our sense of like self-regard in order to achieve belonging. And so that's, one way to think about how these different needs get pitted against each other. Okay, I want to start with a reflection question. And I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think back to the last in-person conversation that you had. So ideally, you are face to face with this human in the same room. Obviously, COVID has made that more complicated. So, if the last conversation you had or all of the conversations you've been having with people have been taking place through screens, I think that the main thing is that you have access to voices and faces. So I don't want to think about like a text message exchange or like DMs. And I want you to make some notes of the details of that conversation and consider the following. Did you feel like you were really heard or listened to in that conversation? Why or why not? And how did you know that they were really listening? And you can put your answers in the chat as they're coming up, or this is an opportunity if you want to raise your hand and be unmuted and come on screen. I love that. Whatever options feel good for you. But before we do that, let's just take 3 minutes to sit with this reflection question. Okay. So again, you can raise your hand if you want to unmute, or you can share some of your reflections in the chat. Oh, oh, yeah. Go for it, Bridget.
Recently, I've had a number of friends and family come in to help me because I'm having a disabled flare and I'm having trouble managing things at home. When my daughter came most recently, she was really agitated. Work is stressful. She was taking time out of that to come here and help me. And it appeared that she was having a really hard time slowing down and just being present here now. Like she was just moving at really high speed. And yet, as she spoke to me and responded to what I was saying, it was clear that she had heard me. Her communication style at this time in her life is different from mine. And I also want to acknowledge that she has ADHD. And so as the conversation was initially happening, I didn't feel like I was really heard or listened to. And yet in her response, it was clear that she really was giving me her full attention. Even if her attention was split, it was full enough to really hear and respond to me. So there's some different communication styles to work with there as well.
Love that share, Bridget. Thank you. Because yeah, I think we have certain ideas of what it looks like to listen to someone that are based on like very neurotypical definitions. And I want to hear, I'm not sure if what Jack wants to share is riffing off of that. So I'll pause myself just in case, because I'd love to hear from you, Jack. But I'll circle back to how neurodivergence can make things look a lot different in terms of like how we feel listened to. Jack, you can feel free to unmute and share.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
So actually, ironically, in a way, the conflict I was thinking of does center this puzzle piece, I guess. The conflict I was thinking about, and I guess I'll do a content warning for autistic meltdowns and some forms of like self-harm within the meltdown rather. So I have a really bad instance of I just do not like lotion sunblock. It is a sensory nightmare for me. And also in terms of like, I guess, clarity, I was going to get in the pool and my partner at the time was like, well, you're not getting in this pool without putting on sunblock, but they put on all of the spray on sunblock. So I was like, I can't really get in the pool then. And in this instance, it was more along the lines of like teasing maybe, or just like, well, you're not getting in otherwise. And so I eventually did put on the sunblock, had a whole meltdown over it, and eventually did get in the pool. And I had a meltdown and I tried like scratching it off my skin, which because of the sensation, I guess, I don't know. And then his response was, are you done with whatever that is or whatever that was? And I was kind of feeling a type of way, Peanut. I'm sorry, dog. And I just kind of was like, I'm gonna go relax for a bit. And I fell asleep for a few minutes and I came back And for some reason, I felt like I had to apologize. And I guess like if this is an instance of where I needed to feel heard, I don't think I did. I kind of felt like, and this is like, I'm glad I'm in this class because I struggle with trying to communicate through those instances of neurodivergence of exactly how hard my boundaries are on something. And because of my trauma, it's very easy for me to be swayed in a way that makes me distinctly uncomfortable. Um, and so I guess in this instance, I was struggling to see how do you know they were really listening. Um, and like I said, I'm gonna have a meltdown. And his response was like, I've seen people have meltdowns before. I'm okay with that. And it puts me in this odd space. And I'm hoping that with the centering of neurodivergence, for both him and me, right? Clarity can be brought to me about like where the breakdown in communication was for that and all of those different things. So yeah, I'll stop now. Yeah.
Thank you, Jack. Yeah. You know, it's like already we've grown up in a world that hasn't given us the tools we need to communicate. And then on top of that, we have trauma, we have neurodivergence, we have exhaustion from like being 3 years into a global pandemic. Like there's so many reasons on top of already like just not having learned these skills that we struggle to communicate. And, you know, I think so much of, part of the reason of these questions is for folks to really, think about like, okay, what are the things that allow me to feel seen and heard? Because I think it's often easier to pinpoint when we're not feeling seen and heard, but to figure out like why or like what is influencing that and what it is we need. And so some of the tools that we're going to talk about, I think, like allow reflection, allow mirroring back, allow these different tools that we can kind of harness to show, hey, I'm listening. Because I think like we've been taught that like, oh, okay, someone making eye contact with me is a way that they show that they're listening. But so many folks with like different forms of neurodivergence, especially like, folks who are autistic, like making eye contact can be really challenging and can actually distract from being present and paying attention. So we're all going to have different definitions of what it feels like to be listened to. And we're going to have to check in with those that we're in conversation with to say like, hey, does that feel like a way that that feels like something you could do or not? Tell me what it looks like for you when you're listening and paying attention. And so we get to define that relationship to relationship, context to context. And there are some things that we can do to like help promote that. I want to read Amber's comment. Amber, I had a conflict with my partner just before this webinar, serendipitous timing. I was triggered because I felt like I wasn't being heard. I felt invalidated by how he was communicating in that conversation. He seemed to be getting defensive in response to me sharing concerns about hosting a party at our apartment. It's as if he was more interested in being right than hearing me and assuming my concerns to be valid and working together as a team. And since this is a pattern for us, these conflicts can sometimes feel hopeless or demoralizing. We both have ADHD, so emotions spike swiftly. Yeah, I mean, the defensiveness response is so common, that falls underneath the compete sort of conflict mode of like needing to be right. And it makes it really hard for us to collaborate, which is really like the goal. Sometimes we need to compromise, but ideally, if we have the conditions for collaboration, that's what's going to make everyone feel good. And so, yeah, it sounds like in that situation, and if this is like a pattern, then that there's some sort of defensive response coming up there. And I know for me, when I experience that in conflict with people, that makes me go into like appease mode and like shut down like so quickly because I want like the defensiveness or the frustration is really hard for me to experience. Nina sharing, I often feel heard when someone responds to what I actually said versus what they interpreted, or when someone checks to make sure they got my meaning. Amazing. And we're going to talk about that with active listening. But first, I want to do one more reflection question with you all. So, what do you need in order to feel fully present or as present as possible during a hard conversation? And again, I'll give you 3 minutes or so to reflect on this question, and then we'll hear some of your responses. Okay, Barry, I'm seeing you sharing in the chat, really resonates with me. I find that I need a place that is calming, and then knowing that I have the ample amount of time to have the conversation with whomever I'm having it with. Yes, the time and the place really are so important for setting that stage for the conversation. My neurodivergence makes it really hard for me in general to have conversations with folks in loud spaces. But if we're having a hard conversation, like it's especially hard for me if there's a lot of background noise, other people are talking, there's like loud music happening, because our trauma brain actually like wants to focus on the background noise. So having a place that is calming, absolutely, and knowing that you have the ample amount of time to have the conversation. Trying to squeeze in a conversation when you know that you've got maybe 15 minutes, maybe half an hour, even if that might actually be all the time that the conversation needs, it's going to make it really hard to be present because you're going to be thinking about that watch that's ticking. And trauma brain is always geared towards urgency. When there is conflict, we want to solve it like right away, or we want to pretend it just doesn't exist. And so giving ourselves the amount of time to have the conversation is really, really great. Amber, during a hard conversation, in order to feel fully seen, I need to feel that the other person's nervous system is calm and regulated, or trust that they have the skills to manage their emotions system and pause if needed in order to regulate themselves. Yes, I love that. This is another reason why pausing is often important, because in the moment of conflict, it is really, really common for our nervous system to get activated. And there's a certain amount of activation that I think we can really work with. And then there's a zone of activation we can go into where we are not hearing each other because the only thing our nervous system cares about is protecting us. That's its number one goal. Getting curious, asking questions, being compassionate towards the other person, collaborating, none of those things matter to the trauma brain, to our dysregulated nervous system. So yeah, having a conversation, and making sure that both people are stepping into the conversation and prioritizing like nervous system regulation before, during, and after. Lane, breaks, something to fidget with, well-established sense of collaboration and mutual care, to feel heard, low stimulus environment, previously communicated / agreed upon amount of time to spend, trust that we can handle things getting messy and escalated. Yeah. Again, emphasizing the importance of breaks. It could just be like a 2-minute break to just like breathe or drink some water. It might be that you need to have a break for 24 hours. And I love also this piece around like communicating and agreeing upon an amount of time to spend. Because, some people, like, I could talk through conflict for hours. Other folks might have about an hour in them before they know that like it's gonna be a lot. And so figuring out that agreed upon time, knowing that you might need to have further conversations, right? I also love the like, regulating tools, something to fidget with, low stimulus. But also I'm hearing like a sense of like, trust in the other person, right? There might be people you get into conflict with who you don't trust to actually be able to show up and have that conversation with you. And so that's going to create a different kind of challenge. Mo, trust that the other cares about my well-being. Yes. Kelsey, if I'm not leading the hard conversation, I need affirmation of the other person's loving and collaborative intentions. I need assurance and confidence that I will have the opportunity to be seen as real and valid as the person bringing up hard things to hear. Yeah. So, I talk about this often as like we need radical honesty, but we also need like radical receptivity. Like we need to know that there is space for both of us to exist in this conversation, and that we both might have had two totally different experiences, equally valid in their own ways. And so knowing that you're going to have space to also be seen and heard, and again, here we're talking about conflict, like we're not talking about situations of abuse and violence where there need to be different kinds of caveats around that. But in a situation of conflict, absolutely. Bridget, limited distraction, sometimes side by side rather than face to face. Love that. Yes, it can sometimes be so much easier to just not have to look at the person as you're talking. As a funny anecdote, I remember watching a season of Love is Blind. And, the basic premise of the show is that two people get to know each other for weeks without seeing each other. And so they're having these conversations through a wall. And one couple, once they get out of, and they're in the real world together, they're finding it really hard to have hard conversations. And so they actually sit on opposite sides of a wall where the door is open so they can hear each other, but they're not seeing each other. And that like allowed them to feel safe enough. Also love taking care of the body. Everyone's hydrated, fed. There's enough time to unfold. Yes. Being uninterrupted as I bring my initial thoughts. When interrupted, I lose my train of thought and get frustrated. Yes. Jack, during hard conversations with calmer energy, physical touch, reassurance, and being able to emote with the understanding that it is simply a response. Tears, stuttering, stimming, yes. Space for the messiness, right? Of just like being a human with feelings. Which side by side is such a helpful idea because I can have such a hard time not trying to be hyper vigilant about the other person's facial reactions or body language. Yeah. Maddie, much of what was already said, as well as establishing what we're talking about and staying on that topic as much as possible. i.e., talking about this present conflict and not necessarily picking apart people's personalities or a different conflict from like 2 years ago. Absolutely. And so, you get to set these intentions and ask for these needs prior to having a conversation. I know it sounds wild, but actually it is like a thing that is absolutely necessary. Especially, as we're getting to know someone and we're getting to figure out like how can we move through these hard conversations in a way that's as supportive to everyone else. And being clear on what you're both hoping to get out of the conversation. I recently had some, I would say harm, not like abuse happen, but harm happen. And the person that had caused the harm was like willing to have a repair conversation with me. And, they made it clear that they were like, I'm here to listen to like what you have to say and to, be accountable. But I had actually already sent them like a very lengthy email, like detailing like, here's the harm that I experienced, and here's why it was harmful. And so I wrote back and I was like, well, actually, the thing that I need is to hear your reflections on what I shared, because I feel like I've already said everything that I need to say. And for me, an apology, really requires you to understand your behavior so that you do not enact that behavior again. So having that clear communication. Bridget also sharing walking to give our bodies a way to diffuse stress response often helps, especially if we are in natural environments rather than built environments. I love that. Nature is also a great co-regulator, and the movement of walking, of having left and right alternation, actually allows the left and right parts of your brain to speak to each other more easily. So I love that as a strategy. Okay, so lots of great tools here, for thinking about how do I set the stage to have this conversation. Now let's talk about what it looks like when we're in the conversation. And here you've already captured it. Time, trust, space, openness were kind of my recaps. Okay, so you may have heard the term active listening, and may or may not know what it means. So I want to offer some more insight. So active listening is a term that's used to describe a general approach to listening that helps you gain more information, improve your understanding of the other points of view, and work collaboratively with others. So with active listening, we're not sitting there listening, already formulating our response in our mind. And of course, our brain is going to want to automatically do that. And what we can do in those moments is just, in the same way that people talk about meditation, if you're meditating and you just notice your brain just drifting away, just bringing yourself back to the moment. But again, we really have those goals of like, I want to understand, and I might need more information in order to understand where this person is coming from. And I really want to work collaboratively with them. This approach requires not just that you learn and remember what the other person has said, but also that you communicate your interest and involvement. And we'll talk about what it looks like to kind of do that. But, this is where we have verbal and nonverbal forms of communication. So, nodding as the person is speaking. If making eye contact is accessible for you, making eye contact can be a way to communicate interest. Not being on your phone. If you have other, like fidgeting needs, to have those. And if this person doesn't know you super well, to just let them know like, hey, this is actually just like a tool that I use to actually stay present. So, in an ideal world, active listening is a part of all of our interactions. And sometimes we're just not at our best. Sometimes we're tired. Sometimes we're stressed. sometimes like we're just going through it. And so I really want to encourage you to like not be afraid to ask the other person to repeat themselves if you've realized that you just zoned out. I also want to invite you to not be afraid to pause if your brain isn't working as optimally as you'd like it to. So you can always say something like, hey, what you just said to me feels really important, and I'd like to take a minute to process it. Doing that actually shows that interest and involvement because it honors your own brain's processing. And like you are pausing there because you want to give credit to what has been shared with you. So yeah, when you vocalize your own limitations and let the person you're talking to know where you're at, they can feel affirmed and cared for. So here are some strategies for active listening. The first is mirroring back. And this is really one of my favorite ways to do active listening because it allows me to clarify that I understood what was being said to me. And it gives the person that you are talking to a moment to reflect as well. Sometimes we say something and we realize when someone repeats it back to us that, oh, that actually wasn't what I meant. What I meant to say was X. So mirroring back really looks like, I hear you saying that it was hurtful when I didn't remember the plans that we had made. Is that correct? Or I get the impression from what you've shared that you're feeling hurt. Or let me see if I understand what you've just shared with me. And again, doing your own paraphrase back to them. And always checking in after to say like, is that correct? Like, did I understand? Are you feeling seen and heard by my recap there? We can also ask clarifying questions and, excuse me, statements. So I think we're really often afraid to ask questions because we think it might make the other person think that we're not listening or we don't understand. But really, I want to say most people like being asked questions because it shows that you care. So some like clarifying questions and statements might look like, tell me a little bit more about X. What are your feelings right now, or how are you feeling about what you've just described? Because we might think based on the way someone's communicating, we might think like, oh, this person's angry with me. But what they might actually be feeling is just like sadness or confusion. And so asking that question to get a sense of those feelings is also like really great information for us to have. Another clarifying question or statement, is like you appear concerned about this. Insert whatever this is. Don't just say this because vague pronouns can be very confusing. So, you appear concerned about the fact that I haven't been taking the initiative to plan any of our date nights. Is that true? I'm wondering if there are folks, and I'm already seeing Lee sharing a suggestion in the chat, but I would love if you have some of your own things that you say or ask in your active listening toolbox to share. Lee, sometimes I ask people to say the same thing, but in a different way so I can understand better. Yes. At least I asked my therapist and partner to do so. I have ADHD. Yeah, and it could be neurodivergence. It could also just be like, we're just sometimes like we really miss each other. Like it just happens. And so you can say like, I'm feeling like I don't entirely understand what you've just shared there. Could you try like saying it differently to me? So I love that. So Medina, is it weird I find these clarifying questions stressful? Most times they feel like I have to demonstrate with evidence my feelings or justify them. I mean, that's, important information for you to have. I think how someone asks a question is really important. I have had hard conversations with people who have asked questions in a way that felt defensive or judgmental, or like, yeah, they were not having really what I was saying. So, I guess understanding the intention behind the questions is helpful. And, you can also ask your own question in response. So I, think of a tool from Brene Brown, who I have complicated feels about, but she says lots of great things. She talks about this phrase, the story I'm telling myself is. And so, like saying like, if someone asks you a clarifying question, you might respond by saying like, the story I'm telling myself is that you're like asking me this question because you want me to like give you evidence or justify my feelings. Is that accurate? And then they will have their own response, but hopefully their response is like, oh no, like not at all. Like this is like the first time maybe I've heard someone like, share this need, and like I just want to better understand it. It's also fair if like you don't want to be asked clarifying questions. I mean, that's something to like navigate with the person that you're in relation with. Um can I repeat the story I'm telling myself is, Jack? Is that the thing that you want me to repeat? Yeah. So yeah, so you use this formulation, the story I'm telling myself is. And so for me, like a different example of this is someone who I've texted to make plans with, and it's been 3 days and they haven't responded. The story I'm telling myself is that this person does not want to hang out with me. That's maybe like the best case story. The worst case story is like that this person does not want to be my friend. This person wants nothing to do with me. So I will say to them, hey, I know this probably isn't what's happening, but the story I'm telling myself is that you haven't responded to my text because you don't want to hang out with me. I'd love to hear more about what's actually going on here. And their response will likely be, oh my gosh, that's totally not what's happening. I'm so sorry. The past couple of days have just been bananas, or, I've been having a chronic pain flare and just like texting back I haven't had the spoons for that. And what I love about this tool is that we're owning the story. This is my story. Like, I'm not making you responsible for it. This story comes from my sweet, sweet trauma brain that's trying to protect me. And, like the people in my life that I have beautiful, loving, supportive relationships with, like this is a tool that we use with each other. And I find that like it can really help diffuse some potential defensiveness that might come up. Bridget sharing, some folks respond to these types of questions with, you're not my therapist, stop it. I mean, I'd be curious what's up with that for them. Like, like, yeah, I mean, you could respond and be like, yeah, I'm really not interested in like being your therapist. I just actually want to understand you more. Again, that sounds like a defensive response. And I would just want to get curious around why it feels like that for them. Like, yeah, interestingly, people who say that generally don't go to therapy. Yeah. I mean, I love when my therapist asks me questions. My Venus is in Gemini. I love being asked questions. It is my favorite thing ever. When people don't ask me questions, I immediately am like, are you interested in me? So I know that people have different relationships to questions. You can use a statement instead of a question, like that is also possible. Amber, yes, I love that. I'm taking ownership of the stories I tell myself and give others permission to do the same. And this allows us to communicate more directly about the things we may be sensing implicitly. Absolutely. And it allows us to interrupt the story because, wow, once I've climbed that ladder of inference, I am just like the story I can create gets wild, y'all. Like, we go from like 0 to like, well, this relationship is over. I'm never going to talk to this person again. They have discovered that I'm secretly a horrible person. And like, it's, yeah, the places that I go. But these are also things people who are in relationship with me like need to know about me. Like, you can't know me without knowing my sweet, sweet trauma brain. Okay, yeah, Maddie. Since some of the questions do feel a bit more formal, yes, depending on who you're talking to, could you also just simplify some of the questions like, do you mean? Can you say more about that, etc.? I think the intent is to just avoid assuming and gather more information. Absolutely. You will have your own flavor to these questions. So use whatever language feels good for you to figure out your own formulation. And I love those. Like, do you mean this? Can you say more about that? Absolutely. Yeah, our brains are so creative at inventing stories. Literally, that's how they keep us alive. It's incredible. Anyone who says they're not a storyteller is a liar. Your brain's doing it all the time. Okay, let's transition into some nonviolent communication as another tool that we can put in our toolbox. So I think that like, NVC, I'm just going to abbreviate it, is like a concept that circulates a lot that people probably have heard of, but might not actually really know what it means. So I want to, just share a little bit to define it, and then we'll talk about the stages of it. So it's developed by Marshall Rosenberg and is based on the principles of nonviolence, the natural state of compassion when no violence is present in the heart. NVC begins by assuming that we are all compassionate by nature and that violent strategies, whether verbal or physical, are learned behaviors taught and supported by the prevailing culture. NVC also assumes that we all share the same basic human needs and that all actions are a strategy to meet one or more of those needs. So here we come back, and Rosenberg doesn't use the language of like safety, belonging, dignity, but again, thinking about those needs. So much of my work and my approach to the world is deeply informed by transformative justice and abolitionism. From that standpoint, I don't believe that there are inherently good people and bad people. I believe that there are people who make hurtful, harmful, violent choices, and that it is our work to get at why they've made those choices. And what we often see, and I'm not citing it here, but Adrienne Maree Brown has a really like beautiful quotation about the importance of asking the question why in her book Emergent Strategy. You know, and that why, like, why did this happen gets to be this like just like groundbreaking question that helps us realize like, oh, you know, the other day when we had this conflict, like my partner got defensive. And maybe the reason they got defensive is because there was something that I said that isn't inherently right or wrong, but was maybe something that got said to them a lot growing up and was really hurtful. And so they got defensive because they got triggered in that moment. Compassion is something that lives in all of us and is part of like our core like adult self-being. And so I love this idea of coming to a conversation under the assumption that we are compassionate by nature. In their workbook, which is a resource that I am obsessed with and recommend everyone have, Decolonizing Nonviolent Communication, Minadachi explains that a key point of decolonizing NVC is developing the discernment to know when we are communicating from a place of trauma versus when we are communicating from a place of alignment and connection. And this is why it's so important for me to bring this like trauma-informed lens into how we talk about conflict and how we talk about communication. Learning like, oh, I'm actually activated right now versus, oh no, I'm actually feeling like, you know, pretty embodied and pretty grounded in this moment. How we communicate from those places is going to look so different. So there are 4 steps to nonviolent communication. Oh, Azzy, I'm seeing that you're enrolled in Adrienne and Sonia's Institute of Radical Permission. I am also in that. And that's amazing that you're doing the facilitator training. That's going to be mind-blowing. Okay. I could just gush about Adrienne Marie Brown all the time. And Sonia Renee Taylor is also amazing. Okay, so the steps to nonviolent communication. First, we want to observe the situation without evaluating or judging. Now, I used to strive to be this like totally non-judgmental person, as though such a state were possible. And what I've learned is that judgment and evaluation are necessary survival strategies. We are going to make judgments. We are going to make assumptions. It is human. So what we need to do is recognize, am I judging? Am I evaluating? Am I making assumptions? And if you are, then that's a great time to do some co-regulation or self-regulation to bring yourself back into that window of tolerance where you can observe the situation from a more neutral and like curious standpoint. When we make judgments, you know, what we're basically saying is like X action is wrong or bad. This person is stupid, lazy, inconsiderate. Like, you know, like those are some of the things that like are going to come up in our brains. And that's okay. But when we make a judgment and we stay with that judgment, we shut the door to open communication. The next step is to identify a feeling and take responsibility for your feelings. And part of why I love the Decolonizing Nonviolent Communication workbook is that they offer a long list of like different feelings. So like if you're like legitimately feeling stuck, you can like look at this list. I also have like a feelings wheel that I have up in my apartment because identifying a feeling can be really challenging, especially for those of us with trauma and neurodivergence, you know, who have had to mask, who have had to repress our feelings for a long time. But it's really helpful if we can root into a feeling and recognize that, like, this feeling is ours. It may have been caused by something that someone did. Um, and sometimes, I've been thinking a lot about this, of this, like, another person's response to your need isn't your responsibility kind of like language that's like circulating. And I want to have more nuance there to recognize that, like, sometimes the feeling that we have isn't just about our trauma or, our past experiences. Sometimes the feeling exists because someone did something that was really hurtful. Um, and, so just kind of like doing that unpacking and being like, okay, where's this feeling coming from? Then we want to identify a need or desire. Two things to consider here is that our needs should always be focused on ourselves. So, instead of saying something like, I need you to, like, stop being late all the time. It looks like, because sometimes, like, people are just going to be late. Like, it's going to happen. The universe is going to make it happen. That we, like, focus the need on ourselves and be like, okay, like, what is not being met here when this person is late consistently? Oh, is it like my feeling of like self-regard? Like, do I feel like this person doesn't respect me? Um, okay, getting underneath to be like, okay, this is what's happening here. Because again, we can't ask someone like to never be late ever, but we can ask someone to text us if they're going to be late, or to offer us some affirmation if they're running behind schedule. So we want to identify like what it is that I need or desire in this situation. And then we have to formulate the request. So it's not up to the other person to figure out how to make you feel better. As a teenager, like, I just remember, and probably did this into like my early, 20s, if I'm being honest. I thought, like, I was given this like idea that like if someone loved me, they would just know what to do. And that is a great way to over responsibilize another person and set ourselves up for failure. We need to be accountable for what it is we need and want, and we have to articulate that. So these responses, are not being placed in the hands of the other person. Resolving conflict is something that we do in partnership with others. Another piece that's really important for nonviolent communication is using I statements. You statements literally activate our nervous system and can cause us to be over or under accountable. So, an example of like a you statement is like, you're always late. That's gonna, that person is either gonna go into defense mode of like, I'm not always late, or they're going to go into appease mode and be like, oh, I'm the worst person ever. Like, and so when we're using nonviolent communication, we, this is kind of the formulation, but again, make it your own. I feel sad when you are late to our plans because, and I've added this because piece, and like, you can take it or leave it. I think when we want to be in intimate relation with people, sharing the why is like a gift that we can offer because it helps the other person understand us more. So I feel sad when you are late to our plans because, you know, I have internalized this narrative that like being late means you don't care about me. I would like it if, or I'm wondering if you could just text me if you're going to be running behind schedule. Or if when you tell me you're late, you say, hey, I'm so sorry for this, like, you know, for being late. Something that acknowledges the impact that this has on me. You know, another, you know, as someone who has a lot of abandonment wounding, you know, another formulation could be like, I'm anxious when you don't text when you're going to be late because it activates my fear of abandonment. It would really mean a lot to me if you could text me, even if you're just going to be 5 minutes late. And giving that person that concrete ask, and then they get to say like whether or not that feels doable for them. And if it doesn't, then hopefully we can move into some collaboration and figure out a different strategy that again can get at that underlying need. Because it's less about the being late and more about what being late means to us. Okay. We're going to transition into a case study where we're going to kind of bring all of this together, and then we're going to do our Q&A. So if there aren't any like really pressing questions in this moment, and I'll just wait to see if anything comes up in the chat as I take a drink of water, then we'll look at this case study and integrate some of this information. All right. So here is our case study. And as I read this out, I invite you to pay attention to what feelings are coming up in your body, what sensations you might be noticing, and any reactions, judgments, evaluations that are coming up. Because this is all great information for us. And I know that you are going to have some responses. So Lee and Jamie are roommates who've been living together for 3 months after Jamie responded to Lee's Craigslist post about looking for a roommate. Jamie isn't the cleanest person in the world, especially when life gets really busy, and they've left their dishes in the sink for over a week. One morning, they wake up to the sound of cupboard doors slamming, and then Lee leaves the apartment. When they go into the kitchen, they see that Lee has done all of the dishes. Above the sink, there's a sticky note with the words, "Please remember to do your dishes." They send Lee a text that reads, "Thanks so much for doing my dishes. I'll make sure that I'm staying on top of them." They don't hear back from Lee. As they go throughout their day, Jamie feels increasingly more anxious about going home and seeing Lee. They also realize that they're not loving the fact that Lee left them a passive-aggressive note when they could have communicated with them directly. They decide that they'll talk to Lee when they get home that evening, hoping to clear the air. When they get home, Lee is sitting on the couch with their arms crossed, eyebrow furrowed, looking like they're still angry from the morning. Jamie approaches Lee and asks if they can talk. "Sure," Lee responds. Jamie apologizes again for not keeping up with the dishes and tells Lee that they'll try to do better. Then they say, "But what was up with that note? It felt kind of passive aggressive." Lee stands up and raises their voice. "I can't believe that you're making me feel bad when you're the one who's been totally selfish and irresponsible. I didn't do anything wrong here. So don't try to turn this around on me. So first, I'd love to hear just like what your immediate kind of responses were as I read this. What feelings, sensations, judgments, evaluations came up for you as I read through this? Jack, I resonate with the anxiety. Julia, heart racing. Took me back to college roommate days. Yeah, as you've been there. Yeah. Maddie, oh, this felt very familiar because it's an ongoing issue with me and my mom. I felt anxious and frustrated with Lee. Mm-hmm. Jack, but also fear with the standing and raising a voice. Yes, great noticing there. That would absolutely provoke fear in me as well. I'm going to put a few more reflection questions into the chat because I want to like leave the case study up on the screen. So Medina, I'm pissed at Jamie. Yeah, great noticing. Yeah. I don't love it when people leave dishes in the sink for even a day, let alone that long. So that is real. Woodson, I don't understand always why leaving a note is considered passive aggressive when the note clearly states an ask. Okay, this is a great question. And yeah, I think it's going to depend on what forms of communication have been agreed upon. You know, if leaving notes around the house for each other is just like what you have to do because you literally never see each other, or you have to text, then it might not necessarily be passive aggressive. But you know, leaving notes in general when we could be actually just having a conversation, that's the like passive aggressiveness, is like the mode of communication. Julia, I tend to shut down with passive aggressive communication, so I was immediately irritated with Lee even though I hate dishes. Yeah. So if I feel like Lee is actually frustrated about more and the dishes are just an excuse to get more angry. Yeah, we're gonna dig more into that. Good noticing. Yeah, what's in like, you know, when there are different roommate schedules, again, I think part of the issue is, for me anyways, I have a hard time reading tone through notes and texts. I really like need voices and faces, or at the very least voices. Because otherwise, like, you know, I feel like I need to add like a smiley face to the end of something in order to like have that person be like, oh, okay, like everything's not the worst ever. So, you know, again, there are different ways that people might have agreed upon to communicate, you know, and in general, I haven't had experiences with like leaving notes where you are asking someone to do something that they haven't been doing that is going to be met well. Cool. Okay. I'm glad that that was helpful. So I'm going to put a few more questions into the chat, and I'm just going to mute myself because I know that it can feel annoying to hear the chat as I type. Okay, so I've got the first question is going to require you to think back to our recap, and if the first workshop is still fresh enough in your mind, I would love for us to think about like what conflict modes and trauma responses are at play here for both Jamie and for Lee. And I'll put those in the chat again so that they're there. So our conflict modes are compete, avoid, accommodate, compromise, and collaborate. And our trauma responses are fight, inner critic. That's when we blame and shame ourselves. Fight, outer critic, blaming and shaming others. Attach, cry. So that's that like young part of us that really wants to like attach onto the other person. We've got flight, freeze, and submit. So any sense of what conflict modes or trauma responses might be at play for both Jamie and Lee? And you might find that there's a combination of things happening. And even if you're like, oh, you know what, Margot, I didn't watch the first part, or oh, I attended that way back when and I don't remember, even just taking a guess without even having to know. Okay, Mo sharing Lee, avoid, then compete, maybe fight outer critic. Yes, you nailed it. So, you know, the avoidance has been happening because obviously this has been bothering Lee for longer than a week. One can guess here. But they haven't been having the conversation. Then they leave a note instead of actually having the conversation. So it's like another kind of like avoidance strategy. Then when they're confronted by Jamie about like leaving the note, they definitely go into that fight, outer critic, compete response. You know, it's like that, like, you know, I can't believe you're making me feel bad when you're the one who's been totally selfish and irresponsible here. So turning that blame outwards and deflecting from the fact that, you know, both people maybe didn't do a great job here. Amber guessing Lee, avoid style, and fight, outer critic. Yep, again. Jamie, collaborate, or fight, outer critic. So yeah, there's definitely, you know, some, you know, there's an attempt to address the note that in and of itself is kind of indirect. Because, you know, there's not really like any naming of like actual feelings that are happening here. So there's actually a bit of like avoidance. You know, passive aggressiveness is like a spicy combo of avoid and sort of like compete or fight. So there's an attempt to like stand up for something not feeling good. At this point, I'm not, you know, seeing a ton of effort to like collaborate. Because, you know, the reality is we know that Jamie isn't the cleanest person in the world. And when they are stressed, they can like, you know, become even messier. So like, is a reasonable solution for Jamie to like always make sure that they've done their dishes? That might not be possible. a collaborative approach might be Jamie being like, okay, when I'm really busy and I know that I can't do my dishes, I will keep my dishes in a like, bin in my room. That way, Jamie doesn't have to do their dishes when they don't have the capacity, but Lee doesn't have to encounter the dishes all the time. Melissa, is Jamie attach cry? So there might be some attach cry potentially that's like happening in like, this like, thanks so much for doing my dishes. Like, I'll make sure that I'm staying on top of them. It's like very much like appease, accommodate kind of response. But attach cry, like, is definitely much more concerned about like losing connection. And we're not entirely sure here if that, we would need more information to discern if that's what was happening here. How might Lee or Jamie have articulated their, either Lee's request about the dishes or Jamie wanting to address the note? What would it might have looked like for them to do that using nonviolent communication? I'm going to put the formulation into the chat. You have it again. It's I feel X when this happens because of could you? Jack, this is making me squirm. Good noticing. Yeah. No pressure to divulge more, but I'm curious about like, okay, yeah, not in a bad way, but just like, whew, yeah. Yeah, it's hard stuff. Like, this is a pretty low stakes conflict. And it could get really intense really quickly without, having proper communication like take place. Lane, thank you for stepping in here. I feel defensive when you leave notes about the things we could talk about. In the future, could you start by addressing things with me in person first? Great. Yes. Mo, I feel frustrated when dishes are left in the sink because it feels like you don't respect me and my space. Could you please clean your dishes in a more timely manner? Thanks. Melissa, I feel disregarded when you leave a note. Could we maybe talk about it next time? Yes. Great. Love it. Using nonviolent communication is not a guarantee that the other person isn't going to get defensive. But in my experience, it goes a lot better than, not using it. Let's hear another one from Bridget. Jamie saying, hey, it doesn't work for me when you leave your dishes in the sink. I feel stressed when there's clutter, or this is Lee to Jamie. I feel stressed when there's clutter in our small space. Could you please do your dishes when you use them? Yeah, love it. Yes. It's like, again, we're like naming the feeling, we're naming what's not feeling good for us. We are making a request, and yeah, knowing that Jamie has left these dishes in the sink for over a week, you know, like we may like Lee, and they've only been living together for a couple of months. So these are two humans that are still getting to know each other. And Lee might not understand that Jamie leaving their dishes in the sink literally has nothing to do with them not respecting the space and everything to do with them being just totally overwhelmed. I have had roommates who, when it is like crunch time with a deadline, they are making food, eating, and leaving dishes in the sink. It is real. And so there might be other strategies that we have, around chores that we could talk about, or, being like, okay, like I'll do your dishes when you're like on a deadline, and you'll do mine, in this situation, or maybe like you'll be the one who does all the laundry. Like there are different ways to communicate and collaborate that are going to allow us to find different solutions. To Lane's comment, someone might say, well, I didn't mean it in a passive aggressive way. So ignoring how something was making me feel, how would you communicate that then? So in that situation, you could say, I experience notes leaving as passive aggressive. So really, again, claiming that that is like your experience. You don't even necessarily need to use that language. It could be like, I feel uncomfortable when I'm communicated with via notes because I'm not actually clear what the tone is. And when I've done something, wrong, it's very easy for me to jump to this place of assuming that you're upset with me. You get to ask people like how you want to be communicated with. Yeah, Melissa sharing, I feel angry when there's dishes being left. Can you leave them in a container in your room next time? Yes, and if we wanted to soften it, and again, that's going to totally depend on you. You could just be like, I know that it's not always possible for us to do our dishes like right away, especially when we're busy. Like, how would you feel about like leaving them in a container in your room next time? Bridget, this/that doesn't work for me is a phrase my brother uses in a high school special ed pullout classroom. It's very hard for folks to argue with that doesn't work for me. Yeah, I mean, again, this is where we have to figure out, like, can we collaborate? It might, again, like what is reasonable and what is going to set us up for the least amount of failure. And we all have like a language that we can use that's going to feel good or not feel good for us. Side note, yeah, it seems like these two could have been more curious to begin with about their home and living styles of stress and activity to see if they were a match. Absolutely. Whenever I've had a roommate, there is an interview process. We talk about like how we navigate chores. I've always split up chores, so there's always been an expectation that we're both supporting the other and keeping a space clean. Of course, like people who are messy are going to feel reticent to admit that because they're going to like worry that that is going to like disqualify them. But I think, again, there are ways to have conversations where you can be like, I know that I can be messier when I'm stressed out. Like, and I would love to collaborate with you on how to figure out how we can navigate those moments. Yes, collaboration feels like such an up level. It is. Compromise is always kind of like what gets talked about as like the ideal scenario. And compromise, and again, I talk more about the differences between compromise and collaboration in the previous workshop. Compromise can sometimes be absolutely necessary, and collaboration, requires more conversation, more question asking, more creativity, more time, but it allows us to like actually figure out solutions that can work long term. Jack, I noticed Lee left Jamie on read and it contributed to Jamie's anxiety. I'm trying to figure out how to ask for an acknowledgement via text. Yes. So, that would be something that you could like bring up and say, um, in the future, if we're navigating, a challenging conversation via text, would it be possible for you to respond back to me, even just acknowledging that you got the text, or doing like the double tap to like heart it, or you could be like, it would feel more supportive for me if, I didn't like have to wonder if you had read my text or not. Yeah, Bridget, that curiosity takes a lot of self-awareness to begin with, 100%. And it's what we're striving for. Like, we're learning, and this is why, I wanted to have all of you really reflect on what makes you feel seen and heard. What do you need to have hard conversations? How did you feel when like reading this case study? So that again, you're building that self-awareness. And it's really challenging, like when other people do not have the same level of self-awareness. It's really hard. But, again, hopefully in just asking for what it is we need and really centering that in our needs, the other person having self-awareness might not matter as much, like depending on what the ask is. Okay, so we are now in Q&A time. I am going to take the screen share off. Yeah, so this is your time. You can drop questions into the chat or you can raise your hand. Erica, will you be sharing the slides from today too? You are going to get the recording, so the recording has the slides in it. But I could also send out a PDF of the slides. That's also totally fine. I can do that. Bridget, that's a powerful question. What do I need to feel seen and heard? And one I'm going to ask in as many words of my partner and our daughter. Yeah, it is. This is like one of our core attachment needs is called attunement. And attunement basically describes that experience of feeling seen, heard, understood. And for so many of us, like even people who had like fairly securely attached like caregiver relationships, misattunement is very common. Like maybe you're like the human in your family that's just like the total weirdo. And your family's just like, I don't get it. Like, I don't understand like why you have all these tattoos and like piercings and are dyeing your hair and are doing this. And it can be really easy to downplay that. But it's actually like a fundamental core need is to have that attunement. So yeah, I think having these conversations with those that we love and care about is allowing us to build that capacity to attune, and it's like what you said, Bridget, like when you were sharing your example, where it was like, you were looking for certain cues from your daughter and you were seeing certain things, and in your mind you were like, oh, well, my daughter isn't listening to me. But then and I'm not sure what your daughter's pronouns are, so I'm just going to say they, but then they, responded back in a way that made you be like, oh, they are seeing and hearing me. Oh, wow, that's wild. So again, once we get that shared vocabulary, then we know how to read a situation and we don't have to climb that ladder and like tell a story that actually isn't true. Jack, I think I missed a class, but would over accountability be submit or inner critic? Yeah. Yeah, both of those. So, to just like break down kind of like over accountability, under accountability, and centered accountability. Over accountability is when we take responsibility for something that isn't ours to actually be responsible for. So an example of this is like, many of us grew up having to like manage the moods of our caregivers. And so everyone's moods depended on how we showed up. So we've become over responsible for what other people are feeling. Under responsible is like more of the compete and fight outer critic response of, being like, oh, you're just too sensitive. Like, oh, no one else in my life has an issue with this. Really not taking accountability for how your actions have made someone feel. And when we take accountability, it doesn't necessarily mean, again, that our actions are right or wrong. Like, there are things, like, again, like even folks saying in the chat, like, some people really not liking being asked questions. And I love being asked questions. And so, like, it's not that asking questions or not asking questions are inherently good or bad, but it's that the presence or absence of that can make us feel a particular way. And then, we have like, and also like attach cry will definitely always move into under accountability. Because taking on the blame is what's going to ensure that they still have connection. But with grounded or like centered accountability, in that place, we can like acknowledge like, okay, my action had this impact. And, the person who's impacted can also say like, okay, I know some of this is my trauma, but also this is about just like how I want people to interact with me. And when we're in that zone of like centered accountability, we are like really in that window of tolerance space because we're able to see both sides. We're able to see how we all play a part in a dynamic. Jessamine, do you have any tips for folks who tend to shut down when there is conflict, i.e. not talk or make eye contact? Yeah, so I think the first thing, and I guess this is going to depend on whether that person has self-awareness and knows that they're shut down or not, and the nature of your relationship with them. I might, in that kind of situation, the way I would navigate that is, by saying like, I'm really getting the sense that you're shut down right now. And like, checking in to see if that feels real for them or not. I mean, I tend to have this conversation more with people getting defensive. I tend to be the one who shuts down. So when people are being defensive, I will often just be like, hey, like the way you're responding to me right now feels kind of defensive. And I can feel that is like activating my trauma response to fawn right now. And so I'm gonna like request that we take like a timeout, pause for however long feels necessary. And I always like to name like a time frame for coming back and reconnecting. And what is happening there is that we're giving each other space to regulate our nervous system. So, having even like proactive conversations with someone that you've had conflict with and you've noticed this pattern, and you can say, hey, I'd really like to chat with you about something that I've like noticed happens when we're in conflict. And you get nonverbal and it's hard for you to make eye contact. And that can feel really challenging for me, and so I'm wondering like, what feels supportive for you when you go into that place? Is there anything I can do to support you in reconnecting with me? and collaborating on, a sort of strategy for folks to just get back into that window again. What's in that timeline for when to reconnect is key, especially for abandonment issues. Yeah, I have disorganized attachment, but I tend towards the anxious end of the spectrum. And the first time I ever had someone like call a pause was one of the worst moments of my life, because I literally was like, we're going to pause this conversation. And, we live together. So I was like, when we wake up in the morning, I'm going to wake up and you're going to have moved all your stuff out and there'll be a note taped to the fridge and our relationship will be over. Like, that's the place that my abandonment issues went. And, this partner was just like, I'm sorry, but like, we're both exhausted. We're not getting anywhere. We need to return to this conversation later. And it was the worst night. I barely slept. But in the morning, I woke up. We had the conversation in 10 minutes and everything was fine. And so, that built the basis for me to see that one can hit pause, have a timeline for when to return. Because if you're just like, we'll talk later, oh my gosh, I'm going to go into a place that is dark and unpleasant. Okay, Amber. I've been becoming more aware of my own triggers and noticing that I am especially sensitive to feeling invalidated, attachment trauma from repeated experiences of invalidation as a child. My partner tends to get defensive, compete, conflict style, and in response to his defensiveness, I get activated and get really frustrated / angry. It's a cycle we're stuck in. Advice for us. By the way, I really love the framework of conflict styles and how they interact. Thanks. Yeah, so, I think starting from this place of naming, that you need validation when you are in conflict, and being as clear as possible around like what that validation could look like for you. So, often, so for me with this separating and taking space, one of the things I need for that is for the person to say, I love you. And I need to hit pause so I can regulate, and we'll come back to this conversation at X point. So figuring out whatever that affirmation or validation looks like, a great phrase that I often use, when someone shares how they're feeling with me is like, thank you for telling me how you're feeling. I think we can often get stuck on wanting someone to understand how we're feeling. This is sort of like where I run into some issues with like, the way that we talk about empathy, as someone needing to understand you in order to care about you. And the reality is we are different humans with different experiences in the world. You might not understand why, when you're 5 minutes late, my brain goes to, you are dead. Because you don't have the same abandonment trauma that I do. So what I need actually is just like that compassion. So that might, look like, me saying like, yeah, wow, here's the place that my brain went to when you were late and you didn't text. And then that person can say, that sounds really scary. I get why that would feel scary for you. So figuring out, how can your partner offer you validation, I think sounds like one piece of the puzzle. And then addressing, the defensiveness that's coming up, and like, are there things that you are saying or doing or how you're bringing this to them that activates, like, I mean, obviously something is getting activated in them if, getting defensive. And so getting really curious about like what's happening and having that conversation outside of a conflict space. Like really making time to have this as a proactive conversation. Lane, situation that has happened recently. What do you do when someone won't meet you in a collaborative space and isn't aware of their patterns? Yeah, heartbreak. You have to decide if you can be in connection with that person. It sucks. It's really hard. You know, I know some people who have really strained relationships with their family, and they've chosen to still have those relationships even though shit isn't changing. But they create a lot of support around seeing their family. So before and after, they've got like care plans in place. So that that way it doesn't feel like you're abandoning yourself in order to have that connection. But yeah, you know, this is where like I just have certain values around how I'm treated and how people engage with me. And if people can't and won't meet me there, I can't have a relationship with them, at least in like in what I kind of call like my inner circle people. Like we might be able to have an outer circle connection. Um, but yeah, it's the worst. I'm always someone who leaves the door open, who says like, you know, if down the road, like you get some clarity around what's happened here and you want to reconnect and like try to talk it through, like I am here for that. And right now, like I just have to step away from this connection because I really do need X, Y, or Z things. Okay. I'm gonna answer Soap's question last. I think that's all I'll have time for. I have a specific question around communication during conflict with someone close to me, even when I voice with the I statement and I'm not blaming, but voicing like I would feel more supported by, you know, XYZ. Is that something you'd be able to do? They take it really personally and voice that they feel like they are failing me. And then I feel like they are not actually hearing my request and instead turning inward and feeling bad. And then that XYZ request is not really acknowledged because it becomes about them. How do you suggest I navigate this? Yeah. You know, sounds like a shame response that's happening for them. It might be that they're a human with a history of receiving critical feedback in ways that were not supportive. You know, we learned that if we did something, if we messed up, like we'd be punished because we live in a world with the carceral logic of like detention, you're grounded, like, you know, I'm going to cut you off from like, you know, love, belonging, affirmation, whatever. And so most of us, if not all of us, are very woefully unequipped to receive critical feedback. It is a skill. I know that when I get critical feedback, my brain easily goes to the place of, oh, this is it. I am a horrible person. And then I have to work with that voice and do some self-soothing so that I can actually hear what the other person is saying. So it sounds like, again, you know, maybe not in the moment of conflict, but having that more proactive conversation, you know, and whether like sometimes like couples therapy can be really great for like having that extra person there to like mediate that. But and like another resource I can think of is there's an account on Instagram called Accountability Mapping. It's run by someone named Daria. And Daria has a course that's sliding scale and is free for BIPOC folks called Centered Accountability. And it could be cool to do something like that together as a way to, you know, have this conversation in a way that might feel more supportive because it's like about both of you learning together rather than about you bringing something specifically to them. It could look like both of you watching the first conflict session in this series and sharing your reflections afterwards and seeing, you know, and asking them like, you know, did you see yourself reflected here at all? Like, here are some things that I've noticed. So yeah, you know, it might also look like having that moment of just naming and being like, it feels like shame is really present and in the room right now, and is making it difficult for you to hold space for what I'm asking for. And I'm wondering like what you need in this moment, so that we can like shift the focus back onto what I'm asking for. It can feel really scary to tell someone what we're seeing and what we're naming. I think one strategy I've used with partners is coming up with like little names for these parts of us that are silly and playful. So with an ex-partner, we use the language of like prickly. I'd be like, you're getting a little prickly right now. And I had another partner that like both of us had disorganized attachment, and we use the language of heart jackets. It's like, yo, I think you have your heart jacket on right now. As a way to be like, so those are some strategies. I hope that this was helpful, that the answers were helpful, and that this session was helpful. I am probably in the spring, maybe winter, I have like an 8-part like course that I did on conflict and accountability, and I'm going to be like recording it and creating like a downloadable course that will also have like bi-weekly like meetups and Q&As. So keep your eyes out for that. We'll be talking about everything from like a lot of what we've covered here, but also like boundary setting, and what to do when someone causes harm, and practices for community accountability and how we can step into that. So yeah, I look forward to connecting with you all again in some way, shape, or form. Enjoy the rest of your Thursdays, and yeah, the recording should be sent out in about a week or so, along with the slides and everything. Okay. Oh, yay, Mo. I love that feedback. Great. Oh, thanks, Amber. All right, y'all. Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you.